water burst main with quite a bit of impact on many Londoners. And if I could invite Alex, who is a wastewater person, so not someone that normally deals with burst water mains, but if I could ask you to give an update on that situation, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, on behalf of Thames, I'd like to reiterate our very profuse apologies to all our customers who were affected by the burst on Tuesday morning. Obviously, people are still suffering, but we particularly feel for those people who were affected by the flooding, but we also recognise that wider customers and stakeholders were affected. There were people who lost supply of water or who had low pressure due to the fact we need to shut in the main to stop the flooding, and also those who had wider disruption due to our activities. So we are very sorry to all of those. The update I can give you is that 103 properties have been confirmed by our surveyors as being damaged by flooding. We haven't been able to get access to all the properties, so we expect that number to rise probably to about 120. 58 families have been rehoused. We've made sure that we have picked up that expenses and they are being rehoused. Some of them will just be have been put into hotels because it is a temporary effect to them. Some of them will be have been put into short-term lets because they are going to be out of their properties for a longer time. We are working with those families to make sure that we are picking up all of their needs. Our priorities are to fix this pipe and to understand what happened. Why did it burst? It wasn't on one of our highest risk registers, but so it was not on our watch list, but it did burst. To clear up the mess, and most importantly, to support the customers and the businesses that were affected. That means providing full compensation for the impact and the inconveniences caused. We have the industry-leading best compensation package. We do things like replace new for old. If customers choose to use their own insurance companies rather than our insurance company to do the claim, we will make sure that they get the fullest compensation. So anything additional our insurance package will have offered, we will make sure that they are paid for that, and we will work with their insurers to make sure the process is as painless as possible. We reckon that about 25,000 homes were initially affected by low pressure when we had to shut in the main to reduce the flooding. That was reduced to 1,146 homes by lunchtime, though there will be continuing airlocks, etc., due to that low pressure, and we're working to sort those out. There were 130 households identified on our priority services register as being vulnerable. We attended each of those and provided them with hand-delivered bottled water and continuing to liaise with them to make sure that they had the support they need. During the incident, we provided constant updates to the boroughs, emergency services, local politicians, GLA, DEFRA, Ofwat, CC Water and the Drinking Water Inspectorate.
Thank you very much for that update. One thing that struck me in particular was that you said that the main was not on your high risk register. So do you know what the timescale is to understand why the burst happened? Because it was a pretty catastrophic burst. I mean, those images of water just pouring
as soon as we got access to the pipe, we cut the section of the damage away, and that has gone away for a metallurgy study. And that we use that against our wider reference of damages caused by bursts to understand what was the cause. Was it metal fatigue, etc.? This is a 1890 period main. So it is an old main, but I have to say age is not necessarily a predictor of performance when it comes to water mains. This is a 1 metre diameter main. It's a big piece of metal and is several inches thick of metal, but it might have been poor casting, it might have been damaged when it was laid in situ, it might have been subsequent stresses as it's laid in place for over a century. So a key thing is for us to understand what caused that failure and to update our failure log to make sure that are there any other mains that might be displaying similar weaknesses. When I say it was not at our top list, it was in our top 20%, but that is based on a risk register that takes account of what is the damage that could occur from a main bursting, as well as the age and condition, as we understand it, of that main.
Yes, I think the thing that's worrying is that if it wasn't in the very top risk register and it produced such a catastrophic burst, then are there lessons to be learned going forwards?
There are always lessons to be learned, and we always make sure that at every burst that we undertake a forensic analysis of what caused it, and we use it to update our risk analysis profile to then recalibrate our list of mains at risk of bursting.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, the timescale to get that analysis back and to be able to make those learnings, do you know what
I'm afraid I'm going to have to get back to you on that one. It really depends on whether the cause is easily diagnosable or not.
Yep.
If it is just a bad bit of metal due to the welding or the seaming, that should be easy to ascertain. If there's some form of corrosion or something, that might be easy to ascertain, but other reasons may be more difficult. I wouldn't want to mislead you with saying we'll know by tomorrow, but certainly I will go back to the office and make sure we can give you our best estimate on that.
Of course, and I think the question is then if it was a bit of bad welding, there could be bits of bad welding all over the place, all over the system, and are there ways for you to be able to detect other bits of pipe that might have a similar risk in future going forward? Jeanette, I'll bring in Andrew.
On the issue of compensation, are you committing to compensating all consequential losses as well? I saw your representative on the television news last night. He seemed to be very shifty when he was asked about the extent to which you're prepared to compensate people.
I'm afraid I have to get back to you on that one. We do, as I say, we have industry-leading compensation package. It's been externally reviewed.
Well, that's not quite the same, is it? As saying that you'll compensate everybody for all the consequential losses they may suffer. Yeah,
I just don't want to make a promise to you that is erroneous. So, we will write back to you straight away to clarify that point.
Well, I think it is important because people will have lost a lot out of all this, not just damage to their property. They'll have lost. For example, there was a woman on the television saying it's costing £50 in a taxi to take a kid to and from school because she's been rehoused in Enfield.
I totally understand.
And the other people have lost earnings while they've been trying to sort out the mess that you've created for them.
Absolutely.
So I think consequential losses have to be fully compensated. And if you don't, I say your chap on the TV last night was distinctly shifty, and it was put up to actually deal with this. So it does make one question whether, in fact, your offer of compensation is as good as you say it is.
Jeanette, did you want to?
Yes, Chair, and apologies for late. It was just I was in the area this morning and was with, as Andrew has just said, families who were popping back for school uniforms for the rest of the week and, stuff from the area because they've been moved out. And I just have to say a couple, and it's a comment really. It seems that Thames Water really need to get a grip. I can't understand that they knew that we were talking about flooding and there was this disaster of a leak and other issues in North London, and they didn't supply us through you, Chair, with a statement and an update.
There was actually I did receive an email yesterday evening with an update, which I passed on to the scrutiny team. Okay. I'm sorry I didn't circulate it to everyone.
Because I think then in that, I can answer Andrew's question. We have a history of going back over 10 years of leakage, some of them as drastic as this. And members will recall not so long ago where it wasn't just the north, it was the north, the south and the west. And what that speaks to is an absolute need for investment into the infrastructure. So I'm not going to ask, because Alex, with respect, as you know, it's not within your remit, but it's just to say that this will not rest. And that I understand there will be questions asked in Parliament because somebody has got to say this has got to stop. People cannot be paying their rates for a service and for that service not to be investing in the infrastructure that will enable them to get on with their lives.
If I could just respond to that point, Chair. Yes, Jeanette, you are exactly right. We had a cluster of bursts in October 16 and January 17. had 8 major bursts. That led to an independent forensic review into our approaches by Paul Cuttle, who I believe attended this committee and answered that, and led to 83 recommendations. One of those recommendations was that we undertake a strategic review of our mains and our mains care practices. That led to a further £95 million being put up to do an intensive care period of looking at our mains. That was funded by our shareholders. It did not come from customers' bills. And that led to a programme of intensive rehabilitating mains, so relining the mains at Liam Vale and Upper Street. We exacerbated our programme of detection and leaks, we were even more proactive to help us identify where are these things before they burst. You have to remember that actually leakage is a much bigger issue than the big bursts we see at ground level. But what we need to do is identify those before they appear catastrophically as they do now. A lot of checking and maintenance of our isolation valves, so making sure when a burst does occur, we can isolate that burst as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, a large number of our isolation valves get concreted over or tarmacked over when there are road replacements or other utility companies do works in the carriageway. And we've boosted the number of what we call network service technicians available in central London on a 24/7 basis. So whether it's Friday morning or Sunday afternoon, we've got the same ability to respond and get the right numbers of people to the location at time. And we've been working very closely with TfL to improve our risk maintenance register about where are these things likely to happen. But I'm afraid, the network is on average 80 years old. 13% of our mains are 150 years old. We would dearly, dearly love to replumb London, but we've got to do it at a rate that is sustainable to London. Our ambition is to reduce leakage by 15% on the end of this year figure by 2025, and to get to 50% reduction on that figure by 2050. We do spend £1 million a day on this. This is not a subject we take lightly. Every drop that is lost in leakage is water that's been taken from the environment, and we take that position very seriously.
Chair, just to come back quickly, and thank you for that, Andrew, and through you, Chair, it might be worth putting down and considering a return to the Cuttle report, because it's always good when we get a response and an organisation quotes a huge figure. Like I think, Andrew, you just talked about 90. What was the figure you quoted about investment?
95 million.
95 million.
Additional.
When you quote that figure, that has to be seen against what is actually needed to get the system right. And so if we need an investment of 500 million and 95 is put in, then we can then see the scale of what needs to happen. So it's through the Chair, and I won't take up any more of your time because we've got the big issue of flooding. But through you, Chair, I think it's worth considering a review of that report and the work that was done there to update it.
Sorry, are you asking that Thames Water review?
No, I think
that
it's
we
us.
Do?
No, it's us.
Yeah.
We take the leadership. If we're waiting for Thames Water, we might be waiting a good few 100 years, as I understand
2050.
Alex, would you like to?
It was just to clarify, we spend about £1 billion on leakage over the 5-year asset management plan period. The 95 million was additional money to try and understand what was causing that spate of bursts from October 16 to January 17, and to instate a plan to exacerbate our trunk mains replacement programme. So it isn't 95 million, it's that on top of effectively £1 billion.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So just
your profit last year?
I'm afraid as a strategy wonk, I don't have that answer. I certainly it is available in our annual performance report, and I can get that sent to you very quickly.
Didn't pay a dividend.
So just to bring are there any other members who want to come in on this issue? No. Just to for the minutes, I think you've said, Alex, that you will come back to us about the risk analysis that you're doing on this particular pipe. You'll be coming back to us on the issue of the consequential losses. And if you could also drop in the profit for the last
3 years.
Last 3 years, that would also be very helpful. Thank you very much. And obviously, if you can keep reporting to the Assembly as you as you review what's happening in this particular case. And thank you for taking those questions, because I do appreciate it's not your area of main work. So to bring us now neatly back to flood risk in London, and the seriousness of flood risk is very well illustrated by what has just happened in Finsbury Park, and that flooding doesn't have to come from a burst water main. It can come from extreme rainfall, surface water runoff. It can come from the river. Just as an opening question to all of you, can you kind of comment on a sort of current appraisal from your perspective of London's flood risk? If I could start with Cassie for the GLA.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. So I think overall London does suffer from a number of different types of flood risk, as you've described, so tidal, river, and then surface water flooding. And we have the people who are responsible for those different types of flooding with us, so I'll leave them to talk about how they manage all of those risks. But of course there is large numbers of people at risk, at either high risk or medium risk of those different forms of flooding in London. And really from tidal flooding, we're pretty well protected. We have a pretty high level of protection with the Thames Barrier and with the network of barriers and fences that run down the river, and also for fluvial risk. At the GLA, we have a big focus on surface water flood risk and working closely with the boroughs who have responsibility for surface water flood risk, but recognising there are nearly 200,000 residential and commercial properties that are at medium or high risk of flooding from heavy rainfall. And this is something that we work strongly with through, we have a programme called the Sustainable Drainage Action Plan that's looking at retrofitting sustainable drainage to manage surface water better, so trying to turn more impermeable surface in London into permeable surfacing to allow that water to percolate through the ground but also be stored and therefore have a slower movement towards our sewer system to prevent that overflowing. We have some strong policies in the London Plan as well to ensure that any new development in London isn't contributing to that level of impermeable surfacing and therefore exacerbating the issue. And we're also now running some nice programmes, which I'm happy to talk about a bit more in detail because I know you've only asked for an overview, but about kind of community level actions as well, around smaller actions that we can take on smaller parcels of land, whether it's community gardens or people within their own gardens, around managing that surface water flood risk to try and reduce the overall risk in London, recognising that we haven't necessarily got large areas of land we can do big projects on, and actually those kind of decentralised projects are going to be very effective. So yes, recognising the risk at the GLA, we have some strong policies set out in the London Environment Strategy around what we're going to do. Lots of it working with the partners who are around this table, which is great, so happy to talk about those projects in more detail as we go through.
Great, and we're very aware of the surface water flooding risk here in City Hall, where we have basement rooms that go out of action as soon as we get heavy rain. And in fact, the doors into the building, the circulating doors, get closed and they fill them up with those absorbent sausages because the water just pours off the slope of more London. And this is a building that's only 20 years old, and yet you see the water just pouring through the light fittings into the basement. And that's why when you get extreme rain. Yeah, and that's why for us that retrofitting of sustainable drainage is as important as making sure that new developments are built with that in mind, because we have got a lot of that hard surfacing, which I also stood outside the building last week and watched the water flow over the paving outside. And so, really tackling that as well in areas that have already been developed is a huge area of focus. As with any retrofitting programme, it sometimes means that it's harder to get it at scale, but that's something we're working on, a sector-based approach to say, okay, there's going to be, whether it's retail or whether it's in education sectors or health sectors, there's different challenges with the types of land use those different sectors employ, and so we therefore need different solutions to help them. You put maybe different measures in a car park of a hospital than you would do in a playground at a school, and how can we actually get that information to the people who can then install those sustainable drainage features. Great, thank you. Alex, if you could, give from your perspective a sort of an overall view of London's flood risk.
Thank you. Well, I would, to the list of sources of flooding, tidal, fluvial and surface water, I would also add groundwater and sewer flooding. We have statutory responsibility for foul water flooding from the combined sewer, foul sewers and surface water flooding where it comes from the surface water sewers. So just to be clear on the responsibility there. A lot of these things are things that we need to manage in partnership. You know, we are totally in step with the GLA and Environment Agency and others in saying that every drop of rainwater we can keep out of our system is water that either we don't need to treat if it goes into a combined system, or if it is misconnected, ends up in a river with foul water, or is water we don't need to then build larger sewers for if it goes into our surface water system. So we are passionate about increasing the amount of surface water storage using SUDS and other green infrastructure. And we believe that actually capturing and using that rainwater that could otherwise cause flooding to displace the use of potable water is something that needs to be very strongly brought forward. So things like rainwater harvesting systems, we believe, are a urgent and important replacement to the way we currently build. And we're working very closely with government on things like the future housing standards and big regeneration programs. We have worked closely with the GLA on identifying areas where new growth in the opportunity areas causes very high stress on our systems, and then to develop what we call integrated water management strategies. So to identify areas where, rather than just building as we normally do, where can we do something very different and look at rainwater, combined grey water harvesting systems. So considering water use, flood risk and environmental improvement. And to date we've done 5 of those, and we're looking at new ones as well.
Thank you.
We estimate that probably there are about 500,000 people at risk of flooding from surface water flooding from our surface water network. That's a modelled number, so it needs to be taken with some caution. But what we've been able to do is identify the hotspots for that, and we provide that information to the GLA as part of the evidence base for the London Plan and the London Environment Strategy. And we are a member of all the key working groups in London working to manage flood risk at the strategic scale. So we're members of the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee and the flood risk partnerships within London. We are members of the London Drainage Engineers Group / Drain London programme to identify ways to deliver the London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan. And we are members of the Mayor's Water Advisory Group, where we try and work collaboratively with other water sector players to make sure that we are identifying strategic opportunities.
Thank you. Sarah.
So the Environment Agency has a strategic overview of all sources of flood risk, but is responsible for the management of flood risk from main rivers and the sea. So in London, with that overview picture, there's 68,000 properties at high risk of surface water flooding, compared to just over 10,000 properties at high risk of flooding from fluvial and tidal flood risk. So when I say fluvial, I mean the rivers that run into the Thames in North and South London that are fluvially influenced rather than the tidal estuary itself. So 4 times the number of people at risk of surface water flooding than river flooding. So a really big issue for London, and set to increase as climate changes and we see more intense storms in the future. On top of that, there's about 1 million properties that lie very close to an area of surface water flood risk. So even if you're not directly affected with internal property flooding from surface water, you could see access or roads or infrastructure services affected by surface water flooding if we experience those high intensity storms. On the tidal flood risk element, there's 1.3 million people and around £275 billion worth of property and infrastructure at risk of tidal flooding in the whole of the Thames estuary. But we do have a very good network of tidal flood defences, and that includes obviously the iconic Thames barrier that will be familiar to you, but also 8 other flood barriers and over 350 kilometres of walls and embankments and 400 other structures such as floodgates, outfalls and pumps. And they all work together as a system to protect London, Essex and Kent, because we do treat it as the whole estuary rather than just London. To date, the barrier has been closed 186 times for flood risk management purposes, the last of which was just last week, when we saw high spring tides affecting the tidal flood risk in London, and it was closed over a number of successive tides to manage that flood risk. I would mention the groundwater flood risk as well as another element which probably neatly segues into Steve. South London in particular, the boroughs of Bromley and Croydon have groundwater flood risk as well as some others, but the incidents that we saw in winter 13-14 really brought that back to the fore, whereas before we were thinking a lot around the tidal flood risk and the surface water risk. Actually the groundwater risk is something that hangs around for a long time when that water does come up.
So you mean that's water in the ground?
Yes, so it rises
Just
from the
so
ground
saturated.
when it's saturated, and it stays above ground level for often many months, rather than the very intense surface water storms that you might see. The water's there, and within a few hours it might be completely gone. The damage is still caused, but the actual water has gone in that time. But,
Yep.
yeah, that's probably from an overview
Thank you, and
point
that
of view.
brings us neatly to Steve. Would you like to just give us an overview from your perspective?
Of course, Canon, thank you for the invite, Chair. So I suppose from a borough perspective, so as a council, we are the lead local flood authority, and our role is to ensure and protect against flooding within our respective boroughs, but actually we have a duty to sort of coordinate and work as a multi-agency approach to tackling and preventing flood events. And you know, the conversation around groundwater, just to give you an example, the 13-14 flood event in Croydon was primarily around groundwater, and groundwater levels rose over a period of a couple of weeks by somewhere in the region of 22 metres. And that brought water above ground and stayed, as Sarah highlighted there, stayed for a number of months. So we were trying to tackle an issue and divert and move water, which was just continually coming out of the ground and overflowing and overwhelming not just surface water systems, but also foul water systems. And that flood event became quite a significant and long-standing event that the borough has recovered from. People are now getting back to normal, and we've got sufficient plans in place to do so. So as I said, as a flood authority, we do have a responsibility to have a flood management plan. That flood management plan is in place, it's constantly reviewed, and there's an action plan that sits off the back of that. And that picks up and tackles where there are flood risk areas within the borough. We do have a number of them. We do have a number of properties that are at risk and at high risk, particularly along the A22 corridor, which was the event in 2013-14. We participate, as we rightly should, with the number of groups that sit within London, so we share and work as a collective with a number of boroughs. So we're part of the South West London Flood Group. That's Group 8, which oversees a number of boroughs. So Wandsworth, Richmond, Croydon, Sutton, Merton, Kingston, that corner of the borough. But as an outer London borough, we also work very closely with a neighbouring county, so Surrey County Council and the District Council, to ensure that where we have flood risk issues on the boundaries, that we work sort of collaboratively to tackle them. And we've established a few groups that we work and meet on a regular basis to tackle events that we know of and that we're dealing with. So the A22 corridor of the Caterham-Bourne, and we also have a particular issue at the top of Caterham on the Hill, and interestingly it's actually on the top of the hill where there's a major flood event, and that work is underway to how we can manage that. You know, talking about SUDS, we spoke about that earlier. SUDS is a good way of trying to manage the flow, but equally there is a lot of water, particularly rainwater that comes down and then groundwater that comes up. It's being able to have the provisions in place or the mitigations in place to have a sustainable approach should those events happen. What we also do is work very closely with our residents. Communication with residents is critical. Residents are at risk and do fear flood events. You know, when you have a torrential downpour that we've had more recently, you know, very quick localised flooding does appear, and it does concern local residents. So we have a means to be able to support those residents, but equally provide residents with advice on how they can protect their properties and where they can get information to work and to make sure those protections are suitably robust. But that communication with residents is critical to ensure that you know, they're not alone. We are here to help, and we do coordinate and mitigate and reduce the risk of flooding.
Thank you. So is the issue of groundwater, that's an ongoing issue? Because with these very extreme rainfall events that we've just been having just recently, that sounds like a worrying combination.
It is, yes. As I said, we do, there are sensors in place. There are boreholes along particular corridors where the groundwater is monitored. So we do have an activation process. Should we do that, we work very closely with the utilities around how we activate and trigger any activities that we do. But that said, we've also looked and put sensors along the Caterham Bourne itself. So what we are doing is able to monitor flow rate. And that again gives us the ability to trigger a escalation process to activate and mobilise any resources that we need to. So it's working constantly, monitoring not just the weather but actually what's happening on the ground as well.
Sean, did you want to come in on this
tiny
point?
question. You said the Thames barrier had been activated 186 times, but you didn't say it.
Sean, sorry, is this a question for Steve?
No, sorry.
No, I'll bring you in later. Can we let Steve finish?
Fair enough. Keep going, Steve.
Sorry, I had finished in terms of mine. If there was another question you had for me.
No,
Sorry.
okay, that's great. So sorry, you wanted to go back to...
Just a tiny one. Sarah, you said the Thames barrier had been activated 186 times, but you didn't say over which period.
Since it came into operation in 1982,
Okay.
so the 186 times is for flood risk management purposes. It does also have partial closures for maintenance activities and also usually an annual test closure as well. This year the annual test closure was actually at the very last minute, based on the forecast, cancelled because we then needed to close for operational reasons with the high tides we were expecting.
And 186 includes those test closures or not?
No, that's for flood risk management purposes over that time period. So there will be additional closures on top of that 186. That's for in times of actual need for flood purposes.
Okay.
What it is worth saying is that those 186 times are not always for tidal purposes. So at the moment we sort of recognise the Thames as one big system. So from where its source way out towards the edge of Gloucestershire all the way to the estuary, it is one large system. When we see whatever rain comes down through the Thames higher up in the catchment comes down through the Thames. So during the winter of 13-14, a number of the barrier closures were actually as a result of the high river levels coming down over Teddington Weir and out to the sea. And so the barrier was closed and effectively used London as a large-scale storage reservoir to enable that water to come out without seeing the increased levels through London. So some of those operations were for managing West London flood risk as well as for the incoming tide. So there's a combination of use there, but for flood risk management purposes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
On that specific point, I represent Kingston and Richmond, and during that period there was a belief that when the barrier was in use, it effectively exacerbated the problems in that part of the Thames, particularly just above Teddington. You will recall that there was very substantial flooding in Staines and in Egham, and I had flooding on my patch, and the belief was that to protect the lower Thames, we in our part of the Thames were punished, in effect, by the use of the barrier. Now, is that an urban myth?
Yes, that is a bit of a myth. So the winter of 13-14 was unprecedented rainfall. We had very, very saturated catchments. We had a huge amount of rain over a very long period of time. So the ground was saturated. That's why we saw such extreme groundwater events as well. So the river flows coming down through the Thames catchment right through Oxfordshire and Surrey and into London. We would have seen flooding there anyway from the fluvial River Thames. What we were able to do was manage that risk more effectively using the barrier and allowing that water to get out to sea in a kind of phased way, but it wouldn't have exacerbated. It was closed to help that risk. Otherwise we would have seen a wider flood risk during that time.
So, contrary to the myth, you lessen the risk by
Yes.
using the barrier.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Alex, did I see you wanted to come
Yes,
in?
it was just the point actually that Sarah just made. It's important we make the distinction in groundwater flooding due to very prolonged wet weather and surface water flooding due to extreme rainfall intensity events. It took the wettest winter in I think it was 70 years to cause those groundwater levels to raise by the 22 metres that Steve referred to. At the moment, we've had 4 successive wet, very dry winters, so groundwater is only just recovering back to normal levels following a very wet September. So I just wanted to make the distinction between those two.
Mm-hmm. So we have, so we've got the extreme rainfall where you get just flooding because the drains just can't cope and the gutters can't cope.
The ground can't absorb it, the ground is very dry.
And then you get very prolonged rainfall over a long period of time,
yes.
which causes, Thank you. Yes?
Well, just to pick up on Tony's point, I have another point as well. Presumably the way it works is that you stop the tide coming in, so where the water would go up where the tide would be, you get the runoff. That's presumably how it works.
Absolutely correct, yes. So at low tide, the barrier is closed, all that water comes down, and then at the change of tide, the barrier is opened, all that water goes out. So you're effectively creating a big reservoir through London that can contain that water and then go out to sea.
Yeah. What I was going to ask you was how you identify priority waterways for intervention and how you work with the boroughs and local people to identify where flood risk because of poorly maintained waterways. I'm particularly concerned, for example, about the silt stream in Barnet, particularly in the Colindale area, where your people came and have a look, I don't know how many times, several years ago, and there seems to be continuous prevarication about doing something about it.
Okay, so we have a series of models and we have an understanding of flood risk. So we have maps that highlight the areas and the communities that are at risk from flooding. Those are then prioritised in terms of developing a programme of works that we can fund. Often we require additional partnership funding to make those projects viable. And actually what we do see in London is some of those schemes, particularly on the fluvial rivers, are very complex to understand. There's often interactions between the surface water and the rivers. We don't have huge amounts of space where we can put big storage reservoirs in. So we want to, we have to balance all of those things to try and find a solution that will manage that flood risk. So it can take a number of years to do so. What we do is we put forward proposals into the funding pot, sort of into a national programme where there's government grant and aid available. And we apply for that through our processes that we have. We have a 6-year programme with a £2.6 billion worth of government grant and aid available over the 6 years from 2015 to 2021. And there are a large number of schemes. I think there's 88 projects in the 6-year programme to reduce the risk of fluvial flooding. We try to do that on the basis of risk, so those with the highest risk would get kind of their attention first and those schemes to progress. Sometimes there's no technical viable solution, sometimes it takes longer to bring partners together and identify a fully funded solution, so it can take some time to manage that risk. What I would say as well in terms of maintenance, you picked up there about maintenance. Maintenance is a really interesting issue, and we get a lot of criticism about maintenance and dredging and all sorts of things at the Environment Agency sort of long term. So there is a maintenance programme. Rivers are maintained. Our operatives are doing routine, regular maintenance, and particularly in times of flood risk where there are trash screens, and we've got kind of people out kind of clearing those and making sure that our rivers are able to flow as well as they should be. So there's sort of routine maintenance, and then there's periodic maintenance that happens of those rivers. But it is important to note that the people that own the land either side of the river, known as riparian owners, have a responsibility to maintain those watercourses themselves as well. And we've sort of lost a bit of that over the years. In terms of people's understanding of their connection and with the rivers that they are bordering. So the Environment Agency has permissive powers to go in and do work, but it's not a duty to do so. So maintenance is a really big thing that we want to promote, that people kind of connect with their rivers and understand, particularly on the fluvial rivers, making sure that those rivers are flowing clearly.
So you've got 88 projects, you say?
Yes, I believe so, in the 6-year programme.
Is that list published, and is that an audited priority?
It is published. Yes, it's on the gov.uk website. We can circulate the link to members if that would be helpful over that 6-year period, yeah.
That'd be helpful. Then perhaps give me an update on what you're doing about the silt stream, because I say it's been years now since you came to have a look and agreed something needed to be done.
From memory, I recognise the Silkstream as a project. We have about 200 odd projects in the Thames programme, and I recognise the name of it being on there. I don't sort of cover the operational patch of that specific part of London, but it's familiar to me as a line on the programme.
Perhaps you're right and give me an update. And the last question from me is that a number of these projects are done in conjunction with the EU. What's the impact of Brexit going to be on those?
Disastrous.
Oh, dear.
Well, it's true. If you look at the Ravensbourne River through Ladywell was done in partnership with the EU. That's an example.
Can we let our guest answer?
Yes, so in the past we have done a number of projects, particularly the Ladywell one that you mentioned with the EU Life funding. So we bid to regeneration funds and other project funds that have had European funding. We will have to look for other partnership funding sources and green investment, green financing, other financing initiatives to attract additional funding once we leave, if we leave.
So you lose access to that money.
We plenty more.
Let's not have a Brexit discussion. Steve, you did indicate that you wanted to come in.
I did, and it was more just to sort of bring down to a local level the conversation around how the Thames is used as an ability to manage the flow of water when needed. When we were dealing with the flooding in Croydon, we had to take the same approach because what was happening is we were trying to overpump to protect property, and that was just causing a problem further downstream. So therefore we identified temporary flood storage areas and in fact built them during the event to enable us to pump water into particular locations rather than trying to push it all the way through the system. Because
So when you say you built them, you mean you kind of contained playing fields or?
So there's a number of locations. So a playing field was one where the topography of the land lent itself to be able to hold water there. So we built a temporary barrier around it to effectively hold the water there. We took advantage of a cricket field and a school playing field along the corridor to do the same thing. So we built a temporary flood storage areas. And then further down, as you went into the Purley Basin area, we took control of a church car park and built an above ground storage area to be able to pump water into it to protect properties further down, because as you were getting towards the River Wandle, which the Caterham-Bourne goes into, and then into the Bedlington treatment works, what we're finding is it was becoming more and more overwhelmed. So we do have to manage the flow of water, and that sometimes comes at risk and actually comes at a consequence where some properties are prioritising where you need to flood and where you don't need to flood. And those decisions are made as you would normally do through the Goal Command process when a major incident like the one in Croydon was activated. So those type of decisions are needed very quickly at a time when it is critical.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could I just also pick up the point about riparian ownership, because that again was a real concern along that corridor. The Bourne along there doesn't naturally flow for most of the year, but when it does flow, it's a combination of open ditch and culvert. The open ditch sections, in fact the culverts as well, what we did find there is multiple ownerships and no one was maintaining it. And as a decision, we took the decision to go in there and take control of those water courses and clean them. And we continue to do that because whilst obviously the landowners are responsible for it, it's not always as well coordinated. So we do it ourselves, and we do work with the associated landowners to ensure that they are kept clean from now. But they do suffer with things like fly tipping, where people will throw stuff over the back of their fence, so to speak. So that type of thing, we have to put provisions in place to manage that.
Thank you, that's very useful. I just want to bring Cassie in before we actually move on to the next section of questioning. Just sort of thinking from a overall London perspective, just what is the Mayor's team doing to build resilience and address all these different flooding issues that are that we're hearing about? What's the Mayor doing to really help address this?
Yeah, sure. So I think as we've talked about in those responsibilities, the Mayor doesn't have any direct responsibilities or ownership over a particular area of flood risk, but recognises the huge risk that it is in London, and with climate change that it's going, it's likely to increase that risk. And so we do have, the team are working on a kind of strategic overview looking at actions around each of those areas of flood risk. So I can take them kind of in turn, maybe that's helpful, on tidal flood risk. So we work closely with the Environment Agency. We have, the Mayor has a representative on the Thames Estuary 2100 Programme Board, which is where the key decisions are made about defences and future land for a Thames barrier, that we might need in the future. We've also been working closely with the agency on the fact that we do think we may need an extra Thames barrier around the 2070 mark, and working closely to safeguard land for that barrier in the future. And that's been a very strategic piece of work, working with our neighbouring authorities to work and kind of find ways of using that land, meanwhile use of that land, so that then it could be freed up for a Thames barrier in the future. The riparian owners that Sarah was talking about before, so we know that as the forecasts for sea level rise are likely to increase, that we will need some raising of defences along the Thames. We obviously don't want to all be faced with higher and higher flood walls. It would be nice if outside City Hall we could still keep our view of the river when we go outside, and we don't end up just adding more and more defence line on top of there, which means we need some other approaches, and to work in partnership with the riparian boroughs and developers and the Environment Agency to work out how we can integrate natural flood management solutions into new developments or regeneration, where we could raise the walls in part in some areas but keep them lower in others, how we can set back development from the river. So we're working in partnership between planning teams, environment teams, and the agency and the boroughs to try and find a consistent approach to that as well, and learn lessons from each other, so we're not having to keep starting again as we kind of move along the river. So that's our kind of strategic look for tidal flood risk. There's also across all areas of flood risk, when we're looking through the London Plan and assessing planning applications, there's very detailed assessments of flood risk for new developments, and that's all zoned. The Environment Agency have some great maps in terms of, it's very interesting if you ever want to look up your house on there, flood risk zone, and that looks at where a new development's going to be, and then makes recommendations for not only the type and design of that building and how it should manage its risk, but also any of the property level flood resilience measures that should be in there. So, for example, should you have anybody living on the ground floor or not? In certain flood risk areas, it's actually recommended there's no bedrooms on the ground floor. Or should sockets be higher up the walls, so that then if an area was to flood, that actually the resilience would be, the bounce back would be quicker, so it would be able for people to get into their properties more quickly afterwards. So that's sort of our strategic look on flood risk there. In terms of some of the fluvial flood risk, we're on a number of the groups as well, and actually we lead a number of the groups that my colleagues have been talking about there, so they got to mention them, but they are led by City Hall. We think that this partnership working is very, very important. So things like some of the Mayor's Water Advisory Group, which looks at all things water. It's chaired by Shirley Rodriguez, and that's looking not only bringing the water companies together, but also the regulators, so the Environment Agency and Ofwat, and also some environmental charities as well, so on water quality and on river flood risk. We have all of those represented at the Water Advisory Group, and discuss issues the issues of the moment there really, and some of the strategic ones. So not only some resilience things, so if there is an issue, how do we mobilise action for London, but also what are some of the strategic changes we could be making. We actually have a project at the moment that we're working on with the Environment Agency up in the Lee Valley, looking at fluvial flood risk and the potential for growth in that area, and how we can start to plan for some of those river defences, taking into account growth. So Sarah mentioned the kind of 6-year funding cycle before. We're actually trying to look across a 25-year funding cycle in that. We're trying to make the case for some 25-year funding for that area, recognising there's likely to be large growth there at the moment, so we're trying to look strategically. And then on surface water, we have, I mentioned the Sustainable Drainage Action Plan, which is looking at accelerating retrofitting, also through, on a slightly more micro scale, but looking through the Mayor's green infrastructure programmes particularly. They have a strong theme of managing flood risk. And so lots of the Greener City Fund measures that have been funded have flood risk, either actually some storage. There's some areas that look at, for example, building, when you're regenerating parks, looking at floodable skate parks, and so actually having some of those areas to hold the water if necessary, having deculverting rivers so that they don't kind of end up overflowing and don't get all blocked up, so they can therefore flood slightly, or cope with a higher volume of water. So really having some on-the-ground areas as well, and lots of that is either grant funding or partnership funding with boroughs or the landowners. And then we're doing our kind of community style stuff as well, which is looking at, we have a nice guide now. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend having a look, called Greening the Grey, which is tips and hints for communities and private owners to then kind of remove unnecessary concrete and paving from their gardens to allow more infiltration of the water through to the ground rather than pooling on the surface. So I think I've described hopefully a lot of different things happening at lots of levels, because we think that strategic approach, while it's necessary to have the overall view of London and work in partnership with the owners of the different risks, there are also, you know, certain priority areas where we really think some of the mayor's funding can be making a difference on the ground.
Just going back a bit, you were talking about the Lee Valley project and the potential for growth. Presumably the mayor won't allow building and development to go on in any way that would increase flood risk.
No, and that's very clear in the London plan. So so any, you know, application that comes in for development, that flood risk, it has to be shown how that's going to be managed, any flood risk in that area. And we work very, very closely with developers to ensure that that's being managed to the appropriate level. So it wouldn't be exacerbating a flood risk.
Okay.
So on that,
I had Jeanette first, but
I was just going to ask about planning on that point.
No.
Okay.
No, it just feeds in when Cassie says about developers coming forward, and then the planning team here then have to be mindful of the circumstances and the possible flooding. And I just wondered, how close do you then work with the boroughs and the other agencies at that point? I know I see some developments that have taken place lower end of the Lee Valley, and I can't recall having seen them. There were all other environmental impacts and everything, and given that some of these dwellings are about 300 or 400 yards from the river, I can't remember a flooding assessment being made on them.
Okay, so the requirement of the planning is for a flood risk assessment for all developments that are referred to the mayor, anyway, major developments. And I understand, Steve, you might be able to correct me, but that would be in local plans as well, the need for a flood risk assessment. So that would take place. Some of those, so that's a kind of application on application basis, and where we are looking at some of the measures that Alex talked about before about how you can integrate some of that water management on a site as well. So, you know, yes, you might have a solution for the flood risk or a way of managing that, but how are you also therefore using that to reduce the amount of non-potable water potable water you might need on site. So how can you have a reuse system or rainwater harvesting for any of the gardens or even for flushing the toilets?
Is the monitoring of that left to the borough with its scarce resources, that when that planning application first lands, that's when the flooding assessment starts?
So the flooding assessment, my understanding, I'm not a planner, so I might look to Steve, so apologies, but okay, great, if you can hear me. My understanding is that an assessment, a flood risk assessment, has to be carried out by the developers, and that's submitted as part of the application. So it comes, and then it's assessed by, for example, for major developments, us here at City Hall. Yeah.
If I may come in, the Environment Agency is a statutory consultee on flood risk. So if there are any proposals that fall into one of the flood risk zones that are on our maps, then it would come to the Environment Agency for any major developments. That's over 10 properties, and we would assess the flood risk. Now, we work on the basis that we're not trying to prevent growth. We're trying to make sure that growth is sustainable and appropriate. So if the developers can demonstrate that they are mitigating against those flood risks, so that might be by raising the floor levels, it might be by other resilience measures, then those developments can still go ahead, or they may put additional defences in or fund into wider schemes as well. So so that's what we do for tidal and fluvial rivers. The surface water risks, the lead local flood authorities are now the statutory consultee for drainage plans as well. So making sure that drainage is not just a bolt-on at the end of a planning application, it's part and parcel of setting out that development so that you lay it out in a way that's appropriate to manage water within your site as well. And that's not, hopefully not just tanks. So the London plan sets out a very helpful hierarchy, trying to make green infrastructure at the top of that list and tanks at the bottom. So you go through that hierarchy and look at the best kind of management sort of process for managing that surface water as close to site as possible and then moving through the system. So that's a little on the planning side. Hopefully that's helpful context.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, because there's so many, it's not, you call them urban myths, but Tony and I and others representing these areas have to hear them because, of course, we're talking to elders who have lived in these areas and look around and they're appalled at the developments going on because they know these areas to be areas where major floodings took place when they were children. No.
Not that old, Jimmy.
Well, it's sort of following up on this point about developers. In fact, I've got a very specific example here involving the Silk Stream, which is the Sainsbury's West Hendon development, where you've advised not to have residential in flood zone 3, but the developers has done that. The application is in. I'm putting objections based on what you've said, actually. But the question really is, to what, and it's also for Cassie, to what extent the developers and borough planning authorities take into account this proposal, I mean, in your pre-application advice, for example, and how do you balance that against the number of properties, bearing in mind the Mayor's desire, which I suppose we all share, to have more affordable accommodation, and this is quite a big development. So how do you do that balancing act? So first of all, what happens if they don't take your advice? And secondly, for Cassie, to what extent is that taken into account in looking at the housing targets?
So nationally, I believe it's around 97 or 98% of our advice is taken by local planning authorities. I don't know the specific stats for London, I'm afraid.
It's another Silk Stream case.
So the local planning authority are the decision-making body. Obviously, flood risk is a material planning consideration for those local authorities. They have to weigh that up against the other factors that they need to consider. In terms of properties still being built, it might appear that those properties might be in a place where you'd expect flooding, but where you build something in a flood risk area, you then compensate for that land somewhere else. So you might see that land is kind of got balancing ponds or other areas where that water can go. So you might see water in and around a development, but those properties would not flood. What developers need to take account of is the safe access and egress of people living in those properties during a flood if that was to happen. So the planning process sets that out quite clearly. The London plan gives us another helpful, very strong steer actually compared to some places in the country, but it is ultimately the local planning authority's decision. But a very high percentage of the advice is taken in line with the Environment Agency's either objections or conditions that they add. I don't know from a surface or from a local planning authority whether you...
And equally, I'm not a planner, but what I can say is that my service, as the lead local flood authority, we do review planning applications. So my team do that. I think it is not wanting to sort of go over what Sarah's already said, but to echo what Sarah said, we do have provisions in place. As part of the South London or South West London group, there is a sort of try to bring some continuity around guidance around SUDs, etc. So these groups have pulled together guidance for developers to assist in them putting suitable and sustainable developments in place, and that goes through that planning process. At the end of the day, I think we do have a high rate of acknowledgement that our information or responses is taken on board. But I can, if you want, and if it helps, I can go back into Croydon and ask the question from our planning colleagues as to what that rate is, if that would help.
Yes, that would be very helpful. Thank you very much.
My question to Cassie: how do you do the balancing act?
So I probably would echo a bit what the guys have said there, because the planning policy is designed so that flood resilient development is built, rather than it being, okay, that's going to stop growth or prevent any development going ahead. So the idea is, it's actually, I think there's a lot of detail, and it's quite prescriptive in the London plan really, about how to design to incorporate and deal with that risk, and for it to be managed either on site, in the site around, because you're right, it's not only at the building level, it's also then within public realm or wider development. So, all of that is to try and enable the wider ambitions and intentions of planning policy, rather than to stop it.
Do you not think, though, that are there not situations where actually building is just not possible because with the increasing climate-related risks, actually the building in one place is actually going to worsen the risk of flooding in other places where there are already buildings, homes, businesses?
I think it's a fair point. I think we can't rule that out, but I think it's very location specific. So it would need, I don't think we can make a general point about that. I think it needs to be considered on a case by case, and that's why this, the modelling that the Environment Agency have is hydraulic, very detailed modelling that does look at that kind of knock-on impacts as well. So that data is available to allow a proper assessment to be undertaken, rather than just looking at, okay, what happens to this individual parcel of land.
So all flood risk assessments have to take into account flood risk now and for the lifetime of that development, so usually a 100-year period, so for a residential property. So in their assessments, developers will be taking account of climate change, and the modelling that we have projects that climate change using the latest data and information that we have. So it is taken into account, and part of a flood risk assessment also has to demonstrate that it doesn't worsen flood risk elsewhere. So they are required to demonstrate that through the National Planning Policy Framework. So it's set out in our kind of highest level planning policy, as well as the additional provisions in the London Plan and indeed local plans.
Thank you. I'm actually going to move us on now to the next section of questions, which is actually looking more at surface water runoff, and I'm going to Sean.
I'm going to ask a few questions about protecting against flooding from surface water runoff. This question is open to everybody. How are partners such as boroughs, Thames Water, Affinity Water and the Environment Agency involved in delivering integrated water management and stormwater management for London? I say that because earlier on Steve made a comment about cleaning other people's waterways. And I wonder, Steve, do you send them the bill, or do you just do that because you're nice people?
I'd like to say we're nice people, but the reality is we during that event we did not invoice the riparian owner for the work that we did. We do have the ability to do so, and we have, at this stage, we haven't chosen to.
Okay. Is there any other bits of work that are being done by agencies? How do you work together?
So one of the mechanisms that partners work together is that there are a series of strategic partnerships that were set up linked to the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. So if I may just take a moment to introduce what the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee is, because that may be a new organisation to some of you that you may not have heard of. So the committee that we have is for the whole Thames catchment, and what it does is it brings together the Environment Agency, lead local flood authorities, other partners including Thames Water, and some independent members with technical expertise. And what they do is bring together a coherent understanding of risk, a set of plans to manage that risk, and then manage and consent the programme of work and investment in terms of managing that flood risk. So they approve the programme annually about what will be invested in terms of managing flood risk. So as part of the committee, and it's a big committee, it's 54 local authorities trying to come together as a committee to discuss the issues. Strategic partnerships were set up with the help of the GLA and Drain London in London. So there are groups of authorities largely based around catchments, so there's some connectivity, but as we know, water doesn't always respect kind of administrative boundaries. It tends to have other ideas about where it wants to go. So those groups work together and they meet regularly, and the Environment Agency, local authorities, Environment Agency and other partners come together to discuss and work out the best way to manage that risk. Additionally, the Environment Agency work closely individually with each borough to look at their local flood risk management strategy, which is a legislative requirement of local authorities to look at how they will manage surface water flood risk. And as part of that, they identify measures to manage that risk. And the Environment Agency will help advise how they can best put a project together. And actually the committee have funded out of the local levy, which is a levy raised from local authorities in the order of about £11.5 million a year. They have allocated money to a dedicated team of advisors who will specifically support local authorities to deliver and to kind of identify and deliver their flood risk management schemes for surface water. So we are putting resources into helping with capability and capacity of local authorities to actively manage those risks. So there's an understanding risk point of view first, and then looking at what can be done, going into those studies and investigations, and then into construction of schemes to manage that risk. What I would say is it's sometimes easier to manage risk in the outer London boroughs where you've got a bit more space and you can make use of playing fields to make wetlands. So Enfield have got some fantastic examples there where they have put in place some fantastic schemes. Some of the inner London boroughs, it's more challenging, and you are looking at kind of how you can manage risk in very urban, high density residential areas and commercial properties, and looking at how you can make tree pits and some of the other initiatives that we're working with the London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan, and kind of the measures that are appropriate for those places. So there is a coordinated programme. We do work very closely, sort of on a day-to-day basis actually, between partners. And then also with Thames Water, and I don't know if you want to say anything about the Future Surface Water Fund, that will provide some additional funding, hopefully for local authorities to take forward.
Alan?
Thank you. So the key new exciting game changer is something called the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plans. So these are currently a non-statutory requirement, but are likely to become statutory in the future. And that is a framework that brings together all the key players who have an interest in sewerage and drainage to create a long view perspective plan. So minimum 25 years, we're probably in London looking up to 2100. It's coordinated by the water company, so the onus is on us to pull these together, but the key point of them is it brings together the key partners to develop, to co-create and to co-deliver solutions to drainage and sewerage issues. So we think this is something that's it's an idea whose time has finally come, and we've just kicked off the work on these. And essentially what we need to do is to look at all of our rivers and catchments and say, what is the risk to them now and in the future? And then to go through a sifting process to identify those where we have the most complex issues, the most complex solutions, and to work with partners to build capacity to deliver solutions that may not always be in Thames Water's need to deliver, but in a shared interest to do so. So some of that work will be building catchment partnerships or building their capacity to deliver these projects. In our business plan for 2020 to 2025, we have said that we want to disconnect 65 hectares of land from the drainage system. So this is building on a project we ran in the past 5 years called 20 for 20. And the idea is that we would provide funding to local authorities and third-party NGOs, etc., to institute system-level and local-level sustainable drainage. We're currently in final negotiations with our regulator about whether that will actually be funded. We are very keen to, because what we think it does is it builds the capacity of local people and local authorities to actually deliver SUDs in parallel with other projects. Because one of the key sort of benefits of SUDs when you deliver them other things is they become a lot cheaper and a lot more effective. So if you are repaving your town centre or you have a major new development and the nice to have green infrastructure stuff gets cost engineered out, this is an ability to bring back that money in and to start to put green infrastructure as a key ambition right from the start of the project, rather than where can we hang a few hanging baskets at the end of the project. So we think this is very important. Steve made a very important point about sometimes surface water flooding happens because people don't understand whose assets they are that are responsible for mitigating it. So Caterham Bourne is the classic example, unfortunately, in London, the unwanted poster child, if you like, for that example. So we're working with TfL to try and identify where are those orphaned assets, those lost rivers, those bits that get wet when we don't want them to get wet, and who are the owners, and try and raise awareness of their ownership, because quite often you might find it as a parade of shops who have responsibility for a ditch outside. They are blissfully unaware, and they are unfortunately unfunded to do anything about it. So how do we deal with those assets? There are also areas where we have very interconnected systems. So particularly in the Brent and Ravensbourne in North London, we've got areas where we have critical ordinary watercourses, land drainage and sewers all interact, and you have this knotty mess where no one has got ownership of the solution, no one has responsibility, and no one has funding to do anything about it. And it's those kind of areas where we are already working together to try and unwind that knot and to say, okay, we're going to have to take a collaborative and partnership approach to those solutions.
You've started to move into in the area of my next question, is how can we prevent loss of permeable ground? Because obviously London is a tension to build more homes. Certainly the middle of London is a bit of a concrete pad. And is there anything you're doing or we could do to, cut that loss down or stop it altogether?
So we have been modelling what we call urban creep, so the loss of permeable land, and made various things about it. I suppose the number one thing is the loss of parking spaces loss of front gardens to parking spaces. So any permeable bit of land greater than 5 square metres, so enough to park your car on, you are supposed to get planning permission from your local authority if you want to concrete it over and make it impermeable. However, we know local authorities, when the state of their resource makes it very difficult for them to monitor this. But it's that small incremental gnawing away of the capacity is cumulatively a big issue. So, what we've got to do, I think, as part of the LSTAP, it says, how can we show people that there are permeable alternatives? If you want to hard pave your front garden to put your car on it, then that's your choice. But there are sustainable permeable solutions in the way you do that. You don't necessarily have to have it completely sealed in concrete or brick paving. You can have permeable joints, you can have grass strips, you can have various other things. So you actually still retain some permeability. But I think the LSTAP, the London Sustainable Action Plan, is probably the best tool for that.
Is there any kind of education about, because you've just educated me straight away, I thought it was you pave it or you don't. But you're saying there's lots of other things people do. I believe people would do other things if they knew there were other things to be done. Are we trying to educate people?
Yeah, we've got a few tools and guides that are out there, and I'd welcome your help in promoting them wider as well. So one is the Greening the Grey guide that I talked about before, which talks about how you can take a small part of your front garden and turn the impermeable area to permeable. There's also through some of our green infrastructure guidance as well, we've got some hints and tips about how the different materials you can be using in front gardens, or when you're considering whether or not you want to pave over a garden, and kind of also explaining what the risks of that might be and what some of the solutions are. So I'm happy to send over some of those.
I'd love to see that. That would be great.
Can I just come in a couple of those
Absolutely,
things on?
absolutely.
So what we're doing with some of that partnership work on sustainable drainage. So through this London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan that I talked about, which was launched in 2016, there's a number of actions in there, and I mainly talked about retrofitting sustainable drainage. So as Alex mentioned, it's really about if there are works going on, so whether that's along highways, whether it's large development projects, whether it's redoing a roof or a playground of a school, how can we start to not just put impermeable surfaces in as we had before, how can we start to integrate permeable surfaces and be managing the surface water through some of those areas? So we've got a few different strands of work happening, working with lots of different people. So one is working closely with TfL and with boroughs and with highways engineers. So because a lot of the work, that's a huge area of impermeable surfacing along the highways, how can we start to introduce some either permeable surfaces or have some green infrastructure along the side of highways. So at the moment we're in the middle of rolling out some training that we've had specifically designed about sustainable drainage to Borough and TfL highways engineers. We've trained 80 officers so far. I don't know if you've got any feedback. I think I've heard all good.
I've not heard any negative comments, so it's all good.
And we've got another 200 signed up for this training over the next 6 months, because we really heard some of that education point was really a barrier for these things not happening. It was the engineers who were actually designing the projects. They didn't know enough about SODs, about all this kind of technical stuff. So really we're getting them in for half day and day long training courses and hosting those and providing bespoke designs afterwards as well, to just start to chip away at those barriers and say, okay, how can we actually get permeable materials being thought out right at the design concept when work's being done. So that's one area. Another area is we have these strategic SODs pilots that are happening at the moment that are looking to try and make a business case and funding case for sustainable drainage. So we recognise some of the national flood risk funding. It, to be honest, goes towards large projects, sometimes river projects, for defences. But in London, actually, we're talking about the importance of surface water, and it's sometimes a series of smaller schemes that might help manage that water more appropriately. So we're piloting a number of these schemes and looking at how we can therefore influence the national funding model. One of them is a nice one up in Edgware Road, where it's looking at highway changes, and some underpasses were going to be filled in. But instead of those being filled in, they're now going to be redesigned as, we call them bioretention basins, which is a fancy word for sink, really, kind of it's an area for the water to store, but there will be some greening in there as well, that will start to use an existing area that would have been concreted up and filled in to actually manage our surface water better, and will also improve the amenity of the area. So starting to say, how can we kind of get the best bang for our buck, really, and deliver multiple benefits, and manage this risk that we have of surface water, because we're getting more intense storms, and this is set to increase, but also because we must recognise that we have got more impermeable surfacing than we had before. We need to kind of have that shift change. So I think those are two practical kind of strategic examples of how we're working in partnership on our integrated water management.
Sure. Can I just bring Andrew in, please?
Just before I go on to point, you just mentioned Edgware Road underpasses. Presumably they're pedestrian underpasses, and I'd like to know where they are. But that's
we can send you some details on the project.
The real question I was going to ask you is, when we're talking about front gardens and so forth, the government have relaxed permitted development rights in relation to those sort of developments. So that removes a lot of the controls you might have to insist on some of the permeable suggestions that you've been putting forward. To what extent do you think the relaxation of permitted development rights enabling this sort of development to happen without planning permission is going to impact on what you're trying to achieve?
I'm not an expert on permitted development rights, so from my point of view, I'd have to come back to you on that. In terms of the different approaches we're trying to take, some of it is about giving people the knowledge about the options that are available to them, rather than just going to one area. So rather than looking at the hard...
You've talked about that already.
So those are some of the ways we're looking at it. So, but I could provide a view on permitted development rights once I talk to some planners. Sure. Anybody here, Max?
So one thing on permitted development. If there is an area that is at high risk of surface water flooding, it is possible for that area to be designated as a critical drainage area, and that is a recognised status, which gives it additional scrutiny. So it would then make the permitted development that would normally go ahead actually subject to the planning. So where you have got those really high risk areas, that is a designation that can be agreed between the local authority and the Environment Agency to designate those areas. So there is a provision. It's not one that's widely taken up, but there is a provision there in legislation to do so. But it is something that could be done.
Encouraging local authorities to do that, because presumably they may not even know about that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean there were discussions, I think, when it first came into place. I think the surface water management plans that were produced across London when surface water kind of became the big thing in 2009 did set out some areas of sort of hydrological connectivity where the water was wood pond, and I understood those areas, and there were some areas identified, but I think in terms of designating, there's very few areas that have specifically been designated at this stage. But yeah, it's something that we could continue to explore with boroughs if there are areas particularly that would benefit from that.
But do you know where those areas are?
I certainly know where the hotspots are in terms of flood risk, and the boroughs then
so
have
you know where
that
the
in their
hotspots
plans.
are, or cold spots because it's cold water. Have you brought those to the attention of the local authorities, and this point about whatever the word is, discarding?
So the local authorities have a local flood risk management strategy that they're responsible for
they know
producing,
where
and they know where they are because
are.
that strategy identifies
Do
it.
they know that they've got the power to designate them in the way you're saying?
Yes.
And how many of them have actually done it?
Very few.
Right. Perhaps you could let us have a chart of where these are, what they've done, and which they haven't.
And clarity about exactly what the local authorities are able to do in those situations, so we're clear that we've understood it correctly. Sean, can I go back to you?
Just a quick question, Steve. So have you, your local authority guy, have you designated any areas that you wouldn't allow?
I expected that question quite quickly. And I actually made a note to just double check. So we are aware of that ability to do that. What I don't know is whether we have at this stage. But I will, as others are, I'll take that back and check to see whether we've actually designated any of those areas.
Thank you. Slightly moving on, what are the prospects of charging premises for the amount of runoff they discharge? Has anybody looked at that? Is that you're
like
chuckling
Alex.
there, Alex?
Let me take that one. So certainly it's something we've looked at, and it is our longer term ambition is to get to that point. We think just as if you have a water meter, you pay for what you use, perhaps you should pay for what you discharge from your property, particularly when you have got large industrial complexes with very large impermeable car parks and roofs. Their drainage fee can often be based upon the diameter of the water pipe supplying the building. So they pay a very disproportionate charge for their drainage. And we think that we need to move to a point where basically you pay for what you use. However, we need to make sure that that is set out in a comprehensive long-term strategy that enables people to move towards that. So it's something we're developing at the moment. Other water companies, I believe, do charge for that. There was a bit of a furore, I think, in 2016 when someone brought it in, and there were big impacts on voluntary sector buildings having to suddenly pay Cub Scouts. Buildings are suddenly having to pay large bills for drainage. So we want to avoid that kind of unintended consequences. But certainly it seems logical in the longer term that we move towards a position where you pay for what you discharge. And that we would see that as combined with a process of being able to reduce the impact of that through encouraging and supporting sustainable drainage and rainwater harvesting.
Okay, but you are doing the work. You are.
We are doing the work at the moment. I'm certainly not going to make a commitment to you today that we intend to bring it in, but it's something we are very aware and keen on, but we believe it has to be brought in, phased in gradually, so people have time to adapt, time to get used to it, and time to build in those measures in an affordable way.
Okay. Just slightly change tack here. What impact did the Sustainable Drainage Action Plan and Drain London have? Let's start with Cassie.
Yeah, so the Drain London programme and the Sustainable Drainage Action Plan, which is kind of a spin-off from Drain London, I think has had huge impact. Actually, we've talked about a lot of those impacts already this morning. So Drain London came in 2010 and delivered the surface water flood risk mapping and surface water management plans for all of the 33 local authorities in London. So some of the things that exactly Sarah and Steve were talking about before, that identifies these critical drainage areas, that Drain London delivered that. That was the programme that made it happen. And also then rolled out a series of pilot projects to really make the case and showcase sustainable drainage in those areas that were highlighted as highest risk from the surface water management plans. It also has led to a lot of great partnership working, so bringing together the 33 local authorities. Drain London was a big case to keep the London Drainage Engineers group going, and that's a group that are really kind of bringing together those flood risk managers in the lead local flood authorities to then say, okay, we've got all these surface water risks, how can we actually share our modelling and share our projects? And then, as I said, the spin-off was the Sustainable Drainage Action Plan, which looks at a sector-based approach for managing surface water flood risk. So a few things that have happened, direct impacts from that project. The training I just talked about, it's a direct impact and deliverable from the LSDAP, as we call it, because London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan is long, so I'll use LSDAP from now. That's one. We've delivered some community depaving projects. There's one actually just in Waterloo that you can go and have a look at, where it was taking hard surfacing and turning that into a community garden, as well as managing the surface water risk. We're developing some sector-specific guidance, working with the sectors at the moment, so we'll be launching a guidance on surface water management in the education sector shortly. We've actually had a steering group with head teachers on it, and actually facilities managers from schools who are actually going to be using this information to install sustainable drainage. There's great benefits for schools in that it prevents the playgrounds from flooding and all these issues that can sometimes either cause inconvenience, but also sometimes schools to close. But also through these measures you can have outdoor classrooms developed, and it's great about teaching kids about the water cycle, and also can enhance the biodiversity. So there's lots of multiple benefits. We're doing some other collaboration with the Environment Agency and Thames Water with these pilot schemes of sustainable drainage, some of which we've mentioned. So some of the 20 for 20 that Alex talked about, the project manager for the LSDAP has been heavily involved in working out the locations and the design of those projects, so delivery on the ground. In terms of planning, we've now issued a standard performer for all of the lead local flood authorities, so they can actually record the ways in which they're changing planning applications to include sustainable drainage and actually reduce that impact of surface water on the sewers. And we've also prepared, it's called the SUDS Opportunity Model, which is a model at street level across London that identifies not only where the best locations for where you should put sustainable drainage are, but what type of sustainable drainage you can put in that area. It's a very detailed hydraulic model, so it looks at the depth of the expected water and which way it'll flow, and so whether you should have, you know, a system that maybe has a large tank if needed somewhere, if it's going to expect large flows, or where you could manage the water through a rain garden or a smaller series of measures. And that, again, was in response to the local authorities saying, okay, we're limited on resource and time here. We understand we want to be pushing SUDS, but we don't know exactly what type. You know, that's a barrier. It's a very long lead time to actually getting the projects implemented. So Drain London kind of responded to that and produced this model. It's now being widely used across London.
My final question talks about how you're using SUDS and hard engineering solutions to control runoff. It sounds like you kind of partially answered that, but give me a very short example of a project or an idea that marries these two elements together.
Yeah, so the drainage hierarchy that Sarah mentioned before is quite a good example. So we do have, we're asking for surface water to be managed on site where possible through green solutions, really, so the softer engineering, but sometimes with rainwater harvesting or, so you can therefore use it for water in the garden or water in communal gardens. But then there is a recognition that won't deal with all surface water in some cases, and so therefore you may need a mix of that green and grey infrastructure. So, and that could be large attenuation tanks, which sit maybe underneath a green infrastructure top, so it looks nice on the top, but then that water is infiltrating into a more hard engineering solution, which is a tank, which then slows the flow down into the sewers to prevent those from getting overwhelmed and therefore flooding. And then also we promote water reuse systems. That's on site where the water is being captured from the roofs or the surrounding area and then being treated and used, for example, to flush the toilets within a building. So I think that's also a mix of that green and grey. It's not, there's quite a lot of water to deal with. Obviously, we want to try and move to as many green solutions as possible to deliver those multiple benefits, but that may not always be possible. We might also need some harder engineering.
Now, we're having conversations with individual householders. We made a comment before about concrete in your driveway, another solution. Is there things that individuals can do to reduce the amount of runoff they have or the water they're using in the first place? Like you talk about grey water to flush the toilets. Can people retrofit that stuff? And if so, are we letting them know that can be done?
So when we refer to Cassie referred to the Green and the Grey manual, so that's helpful public accessible stuff. We have developed it's a box that contains water from your runoff pipe. It has a green top on it, so you've got drought resilient plant species that sit on the top, and you've got a tap on it so you can use it for garden uses, and it has an overflow siphon that goes back into the drain when that tank is full. We've got those designed and ready to roll out. If Ofwat give us the funding we anticipate, we see that as something we would like to roll out in areas where we know our drainage system is challenged by wet weather, and we've got the map to know where that is. And we see that as a sort of thing we would like to see rolling out on quite a large scale. We estimate that for every hectare of land that you can disconnect from the sewer is equivalent to 500 homes capacity of drainage that you're freeing up. So we can start to actually look at, can we neutralise some of the new development by offsetting some of the water that goes into our system. So I think it's finding handy figures like that to start to inspire people to recognise that they can do stuff in their own home, and it has a small but very in accumulation very important impact.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, so some boroughs are taking some different approaches to kind of communicating with their residents. So I'm aware of a campaign that Richmond are running linked to the sort of increasing narrative around the climate emergency, and they're using the opportunity, using social media to have sort of short snippets from experts in the field around kind of different things that residents and householders can do. I recently took part in one talking about tidal flood risk, but we talked a little about surface water in that as well. So I know they're trying to promote kind of self-help for residents as well as part of that. So it would be great, it would be fantastic to see that more widely rolled out across other boroughs or coordinated through the GLA. But I think it is really important that people think about their water consumption, their water use, their water disposal, about how they use these planters. There's effectively a nicer looking water butt that also has a value in terms of managing drainage. That just simple action of disconnecting a drain pipe from going into the drain straight away can have an enormous difference if cumulatively that's retrofitted across a number of properties. Obviously that's expensive to do on a property by property basis across the whole of London, but we want to ensure that all new proposals take account of those things in the first place, and then we'd have a phased programme, I guess, of implementing that for buildings already. But we are seeing it particularly for schools. So the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee have provided some funding towards one of the ones in Sutton. There's a Sutton Suds in Schools proposal where some of those measures are being put in, and as Cassie mentioned, there's the wider educational benefits of that. And actually the context of our national flood and coastal erosion risk management strategies is talking about having a nation of climate champions, and actually using education as a way of kind of bringing school children, bringing those conversations home to their parents, and using educational resources to educate kind of parents about how they use water, and that's been successful in some of the materials that the Environment Agency and others have produced as part of the national curriculum.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Can I bring in David now?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, good morning. So I'll start off with you again, Cassie, for the GLA, because you're representing them. How are the GLA's integrated water management strategy proposals being implemented in new developments?
Yeah, so we have integrated water management strategies are being developed, and they're mentioned within the Environment Strategy and London Plan for key growth areas. So they're not done for every single development. We take an approach where we look across maybe at an opportunity area scale, or even wider than that. It could be to include a couple of opportunity areas, and really it's about areas where high growth is expected, but also there are normally both water capacity issues and flood risk. And so kind of dealing with those things of, at some points in those areas you expect to have too much water, and also you might have too little. And so how can you actually look holistically around that area, and if we do have the opportunity of growth happening, so for example working with utility providers such as Thames, but also other utilities, to then put in some different innovative approaches, rather than just kind of sticking with the norm, okay, we might upgrade the water capacity in this area and get more flow there. So we've developed these strategies for Vauxhall Nine Elms, Old Oak Park Royal, Charlton to Bexley opportunity areas, and Old Kent Road, and we're about to start one in the Isle of Dogs as well. That's just a starting point. So some of the things that have resulted from those strategies. So at Vauxhall Nine Elms, it led to major surface water disconnections from the system, so avoiding much of the surface water going into the sewers, because it was an area where there was constraint on the capacity within the sewers. And discharging some of that surface water directly into the Thames is very closely located, so allowing some of that to happen, so bypassing some of that sewer system. For example, on the Old Kent Road, which is the opportunity area there, it's some of the recommendations from that strategy have gone into an area action plan. So that's around some surface water offsetting policies. So it's looking at trying to manage that surface water across the whole of that area, so that it doesn't have a large impact on the drainage systems, as we've been talking about. And so at a development scale, it's asking developers to manage 70% of their water on site, and then if they are unable to manage if they're unable to manage 100%, they have to manage 70% on site, and then they pay an offset fee for the 30%, and that will go into some surface water measures across the rest of that opportunity area. So it may be in a park, or in another area, a larger area of green space. So it's starting to ensure that the total volume of surface water across an area is being dealt with, but that you can, recognising not every development has the same capacity to take it on, so recognise some of that. And then in the Isle of Dogs, the plan for that is there is some, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but some understanding some constraints on the water supply in that region, and also it is an area of flood risk, as you can imagine, and so managing how can we use some storage of water and look at some potentially, the work is just starting, some larger scale water reuse systems that say we can capture the rainwater and then be using that to offset some need for mains water supply, when it's not needed as drinking water. And we can look at that at a development scale. So we think the strategies themselves have been very effective in coming up with a series of recommendations that are applicable to that particular area of growth. So they're always in partnership with Thames Water, often the Environment Agency and the local authority. So we have a true understanding of what the current issues are, expected growth, the flood risk, the constraints on the systems. So we're really working with local bespoke data and coming up with a series of recommendations that in the majority of cases have gone then into local plans, so therefore they'll be followed by each of the developers. So the strategies themselves, their point is to try and then influence those next level of planning documents that apply to those large scale. So we're trying to make sure that we're kind of agile about them. We don't just want to follow the same model and come up with the same recommendations. So we are sort of developing our approach as we go on. So we're pretty excited about the one in the Isle of Dogs, which will happen over the next 6 months or so.
Different things for different areas and different developments. The Isle of Dogs sound interesting. I mean, I did live in a different country once where they had that kind of system where you capture rainwater when there's a lot of rainwater and then you use that when there's less rainwater. Is that sort of the idea?
We don't know if that will definitely be the outcome because we need to do all of the modelling and the work needs to happen. But I think those kind of how do you do things at scale that are going to maximise when you've got too much water and use it to when you've got too little water, and starting to really look at the water cycle really across those developments rather than just looking at these things of kind of floodwater and drainage and water supply all very separately.
Okay. Is there funding available for all of this, or is there an issue with funding?
So in terms of funding the actual strategies, they are partnership funded through normally the GLA, Thames Water, the local authority. So that's some small money, normally then we go out for procurement for a consultancy. In terms of actually then delivering the measures on the ground, that's why it's important that the strategies are converted or adopted in local plans or opportunity area planning frameworks, so that then it becomes, it's a condition of planning within that area, and then the delivery is done through the development of infrastructure and new developments. Okay. So that's the delivery model.
So for these ones you've mentioned, is it actually a requirement in the local plan?
Yeah, so the one I mentioned about Old Kent Road, that one's actually in their local plan about the offsetting. And the one at Vauxhall Nine Elms, that actually, the project is already in. That surface water is already in. So so we're seeing some direct impacts.
But are there some of these developments that are not in the local plan and therefore would not therefore be a requirement, or is that something?
So it is a series of recommendations through the strategies. So some of those are then adopted more than others. It's supposed to be looking for a suite of recommendations rather than saying this is the one thing, because of course it is an area in these areas where growth is expected, but things can change as you're going through that process. So it's recognising that, so come up with a suite of recommendations. In terms of the one for Old Oak Park Royal, I think we're still at the point where we're looking at, that's about to become incorporated into their next level of local plan. So that was done. The main aim of these strategies is to get them in quite early, so that then those recommendations can be embedded right from the start within planning policy. Because if you're trying to suggest something strategic about managing water in an integrated way and joining up supply, flood risk and wastewater, there's no point being halfway through the process. Those big changes need to come in right at the start. So therefore there can be a bit of a tail in terms of the adoption of them within planning.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So specifically with the sustainable drainage systems, and that's mostly about permeable sort of areas of the land, isn't it? I imagine that's mostly that side of things. Are they incorporated into housing developments away from areas at risk from rivers as well? Away from rivers, but still at risk of surface flooding?
Yes, so lots of the drainage hierarchy we've talked about before, that's applicable. It's not just limited to a river or tidal flood zone. There are also surface water flooding maps as well available, so you can look at the areas of the kind of hot spots or cold spots, as they're referred to before, for your flood areas. So there's different processes for assessing the risk for the different types of flood risk, as we've talked about before. So I think, Sarah, you talked about the assessments that are done, and that is for, you know, there's different requirements for each bit. You don't just look at one map and say, okay, I'm done now. You need to look at the tidal risk, the fluvial risk, surface risk, the groundwater risk. We've talked about.
Have you got any kind of examples of housing developments that are away from rivers but still at risk of surface flooding, where you're putting into effect these...
the integrated water management plans. Okay, sorry.
No, as well as the sustainable drainage systems as well.
Yeah. So the one that's probably furthest away from the river is the Old Kent Road. One that I'm thinking as I'm going through my list in my head. And so, and that's mainly... So when we've looked at the integrated water management in that area, the surface water risk is the key flood risk we've been looking at. So each of these strategies is designed with that local context in mind. Right. So if, you know, whatever the biggest risk is, and also whatever the biggest opportunities are. So it may be that one of these strategies, the biggest concern could be around water supply to the area rather than flood risk. Well, we would also be assessing the flood risk, but it would be the water supply where you might then look at the recommendations would be targeted towards. Okay. So it's trying to get away from looking at, you know, we've got all these different types of flood risk here, and we've got issues with, you know, a sewer system that is now dealing with more people and more impermeable surfacing than it used to, and we've got water supply, and we've got, you know, issues around that as well, and expected levels of water scarcity in the future, and starting to say there must be some solutions that work for it across all of these things. So it's not limited to only riverside, it's not limited to only surface water, it's it's okay for us.
I'm just trying to get an idea so I can visualise it. So if you say like old Kent Road, then that's an area that's away from the river, a little bit away from the river, but has a risk of surface flooding. So in that area there would be some kind of, you know, sustainable drainage systems, not permeable.
Oh, definitely. Surface water drain, particularly, is not limited to beside the river. And And there is a map we have on our website. I can send you the link to it that shows you the kind of the areas at highest risk from surface water, and you'll see that they're not always located right beside the river.
Okay, thank you.
David, before you move on to the next batch of questions, can I just come in with one thing to check? Just wondering, you've described all these different kinds of measures, but are there actual standards that people have to comply with?
So it's different. We have our integrated water management strategies, which are these for high growth areas, and they are looking at recommendations that would then be adopted as requirements within local plans. So that's one area. If we're talking about planning policy for new developments, then yes, there are standards within the London Plan around various areas of flood risk, some of which we talked about, and around surface water management. So, but the integrated water management strategies are trying to look at, you know, in these large areas, big picture, what's the stuff we should be getting in now, and we should be thinking about now, and working in partnership now, because of course we want, you know, any of our flood risk management schemes to be talking to our water management schemes as well, and therefore people to be going in together and doing that work rather than going in separately. So it's two slightly different things.
Thank you. Sorry, David.
Yeah, thanks. If I could move on to you, Alex, for Thames Water, and I'd like to ask you about the Thames Tideway Tunnel. Obviously, that's a big project going on at the moment. I mean, will that reduce the flood risk, and if so, how will it reduce flood risk?
Yes, it isn't designed to reduce flood risk, because it's designed to make sure that we don't put dilute pollution into the Thames every time we have heavy rainfall. That is the sort of the safety valve that Bazalgette built into the network, was that it would discharge into the Thames rather than back up and discharge into people's homes. So the Tideway Tunnel's principal aim is to do that. However, it will take some pressure off the main system by being able to, when you have very intense rainfall, that rainfall, rather than filling the tunnels, the interceptor connections will discharge into the Thames Tideway Tunnel.
Right.
So it will have an unintended benefit of that. It takes the first flush of heavy rainfall, so what we call the first flush. So if you imagine you've had a long period of no rain, pollution has built up on the streets, built up in the drains, and you have that rain falls, the rain absorbs it all and then pushes it into the river. So that's the number one aim of the tunnel, is to try and avoid that, but the benefit is that it will absorb some of that water, reduce the levels in the drainage system, so you end up with less backing up and less risk of pollution.
Okay, that's great. What other localised strategies do you have or are implementing to try to reduce flood risk, and particularly from surface water?
Well, we talked briefly about the 20 for 20, so that was that's the current 5-year period's projects, and they've all been completed now. I introduced briefly the 60 for 65, so we're tripling of our ambition, and that lies with our regulator now to determine whether they want to fund it. But we're very excited about that, and what that model does is it seeks different ways to build capacity of different players in order to deliver SUD. So some of it would be giving large chunks of money to local authorities that have low capacity in their drainage networks to look at big consolidated projects. And our aim would be to give 3 local authorities a total of £6 million each to do that. So you get to have some serious scale work on that. We were then planning to give 150,000 to each of our 96 local authorities to try and build their capacity to do that, to look at surface water flood risk and sustainable drainage. There was then another set of money set aside for big projects that we would deliver where we're doing other stuff to bring sustainable drainage in. And then the last bit was going to be some money for third parties, NGOs, environmental groups, etc., to deliver. You know, the indication from Ofwat is that we're not going to get all of that money. So we are currently reviewing, in the likely amount of money that Ofwat may give us, will we have enough to do, you know, where is that money best spent? Where are we going to get our most bang for our buck? Because we think, you know, our plan is to then move to 150 hectares in the 2025 to 2030 period and 200 in the following period. So it's starting to escalate this programme as a way of building capacity. We also believe that taking this strain out of the drains, as we call it, means that we can have growth in London, and that means that we don't have to upgrade the size of our sewage treatment works as quickly, because what we're doing is removing rainwater that would still end up at sewage treatment works where you have a combined sewer. So there are definite strategic benefits as well as local benefits to these works.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned you're working with lots of the other agencies around, but how are you working with other water providers to coordinate flood risk, and to what extent are you doing that?
If I understand your question, we, in some developments, so for example, King's Cross and London Riverside in Havering, developers have brought in someone else, or they themselves have developed the drainage system. We call them inset companies because they are effectively taking on what would have been our responsibility, but they've decided to do it themselves, and then they discharge to our network. We think this is a very interesting way of working because King's Cross is probably one of the best examples in the UK of where developers have put in rainwater harvesting and grey water recycling and sustainable drainage features within a development. And have created the management capacity within the development to ensure that those systems work well. And we think that that's a really good approach. We don't always think that the water company has to provide the solution to the drainage, and we would want to encourage further opportunities like that. And we hope that London Riverside will do the same. So it doesn't always have to fall to us.
I'm thinking also, I mean, you provide the water for most of London, but not the whole of London.
That's correct. 76% of London, yes.
Do you work with those?
Absolutely. So we're working very closely with the other water companies.
Okay.
Affinity, Essex and Suffolk, Sutton and East Surrey. We work closely with them. We provide water to them. They sometimes provide water to us. There's an arrangement to make sure that we provide water security to London. And we're working closely with Affinity Water to look at building a new reservoir outside London, but to basically support London in times of drought and to support our growth. But we think looking at how we can capture this rainwater that otherwise runs into the drains and out to sea, if we can capture and use that, that helps to close the gap we have between supply and demand, which is effectively 34 million litres per person per day. Sorry, 34 million litres per day by 2045. That's 4.5 Albert Halls every day gap we need to fill.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. That's I like the Albert Hall scale. Joanne.
Yep, I want to ask about coordination between the different agencies, and I want to start with Steve, but then open it up to the rest. You've talked about how you can build up resilience before flooding takes place with flood management plans, and you've got a South West and London flood group. But what about when flooding does occur? Now, you've given us some of the issues and some of the strategies you developed when you had that serious flooding in 2014. But perhaps you can tell us, how do you think the agencies do coordinate, and what would you like to see improved? What could help?
Question. What I can say from experience, so the 2013-14 flood event, I think it took some time for all of the agencies to sort of, not necessarily get on board, but to understand the gravitas of the situation there. And it was moving quite quickly as well. So I think that time, whilst it felt it was a long time, things were moving very quickly as well. And I think initially it was quite challenging to get everybody together, not necessarily between Croydon and the emergency services, the Environment Agency at Thames, Sutton Surrey Water. It was probably more because when you go out of London to Surrey County Council and Tandridge, the emergency services are different outside of the London area as well. So getting them all together did prove quite challenging to start with. Like I said, once we instigated a major incident, that in itself brought everybody together, and I think it was a very, very steep learning curve for all parties. And you know, and for the record, although I've said this in the past, you know, Croydon, the residents of Croydon are immensely thankful for all of the agencies that participated in that really difficult situation and time in Croydon. So I think to start with, it was a bit strained. I do think it came together very well, and actually I think off the back of that event, what I can say, I think the relationships have formed far better, and we've got a very sort of proactive arrangement in place where we are all interacting with the groups that are set up, but even when we're working locally, so some of the local residents, you know, we encourage them to set up flood forums, and working with those and breaking them down into smaller areas where there are particular issues. So I think it's moved on significantly. There is always room for improvement, and I wouldn't be complacent, or any of the agencies would be complacent. There's always room for improvement, but what I can say is that, you know, I think over the past sort of 5 or 6 years, things have progressed significantly, and I think the relationships have been formed, and they work very well. And actually, I think the intelligence and the data that comes out of each of the areas helps form and provide all of us with the ability to sort of mitigate and reduce the likelihood of events such as what we experienced. So, as I said, difficult to start with, but actually I think it's very solid. And I see, it's good to see the nodding from the right, so I think it's very solid, and long may that continue.
Now, you said you declared a major incident. I think that was yourself and the London Fire Brigade. Who has the power to declare a major? Because you said that as soon as that declaration was made, then people swung into action.
So from memory, I think it was the authority that declared it, yeah. But then as a result of that, those agencies came together to then manage and deal with the issue at hand. But as I said, that then makes it very formal. You know, those groups meet, you know, the hierarchy in terms of gold, silver and bronze. So actually there's an element of control and management about how we manage the event itself, and how we try and move away. You know, the objective was to move away from a major incident as quick as possible. Now, as a local authority, we were heavily reliant on the Environment Agency and equally LFB for pumping equipment, and you know, for the sort of 3 months that we had to manage that incident, what we did do is recognise the challenges that as a local authority we had, but equally as the partnership. But off the back of that, I think what it did do is highlight a need for boroughs to look with the agencies about mutual aid and how we get mutual aid agreements in place in advance of incidents happening, because it was very difficult it was very difficult at the time to get mutual aid. Not necessarily it wasn't forthcoming, it was asking for it and in the midst of an emergency. So we have those mutual aid plans in place, or agreements in place. So setting that in place at the outset gives us the ability to sort of focus on dealing with the issue at hand.
Thank you. I'm going to come on to this in a sec, but can I just ask you, I know the London Resilience Forum has been looking at this, and they've developed frameworks for responding to water emergencies, which includes flooding as well as drought and whatever. Have those frameworks been helpful and helped to coordinate?
Yes, in short, yes. For the authority for coordinating, it is helpful, and again, I think as things are developing, we as a borough, but equally as the agencies, are learning more and being able to sort of put measures in place, start to get some standardisation. I think coordination and consistency across boroughs. And again, that was one of the things that we struggled with dealing with the event, is that the approach that we as a London authority take versus what the counties do is slightly different, and actually the emergency services, they operate differently. So that has helped bring that consistency in place. And as I said, I think it's just helped. We've matured and continue to mature in terms of the way that we tackle events when they happen, but actually we want to try and avoid those. So there is a lot of emphasis about the proactive part of what we do.
Can I ask my original question again to the others about, do you think the coordination is good enough, and how could it be improved? Perhaps Sarah?
So I think it has improved. I think the experience and the scars that we still feel from the winter of 13-14 has helped with that understanding. One of the things that I think is really important is the planning process, that preparation, that understanding of, in an emergency, rather than get to the emergency and then say, oh, what should we do? We've got those plans in place, and that we exercise those plans routinely as well. So we would look to work with partners, sometimes desktop exercises, but sometimes also getting the kit out, putting those temporary defences up. I mean, we had the big inflatable thing that ponded the water, didn't we? All sorts of different things. We provided pumps and other equipment and worked with the London Fire Brigade. But I think we've now got a provision in place for how the pumps connect together and the sizes of the pumps that the London Fire Brigade have versus the ones that the Environment Agency holds. So we kind of understand better now how the equipment fits together. So for me, for further improvement, it would be the continued commitment and resources available to exercise in peacetime, rather than find yourself in panic during those difficult times. We do very well during an incident. I think everyone kind of goes into that command and control structure. We've got to sort this out, but actually the important bit is the upfront part for me. So if we continue to put resources into that would be the area that I'd like to see a continuation of funding and support for.
Yes, I'd agree. I'd say it's you have the adrenaline of the incident and then the hangover afterwards, and it's always difficult to make sure those lessons learned are costed and applied. So it's about what you do the day after. I think also it's about constantly maintaining the relationships to build the trust amongst all the key players. So we know who to pick up the phone to when something goes the way we don't want it to, and we have confidence that that message will be taken on and acted upon. So there's a lot more we could be doing, I think, to constantly maintain these networks, because people move on, and I think that's an area for improvement.
So did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, so the London Resilience Forum worked very closely with all of these agencies and the Category 1 and 2 responders. We were involved in the updating of their frameworks, and I would echo Sarah's point, really. Just from our perspective, it seems so important to have kind of the practice and the desktop exercise or tabletop exercises to ensure that these processes are all in place and be able to be managed.
Thank you.
Jeanette, can I bring you in here?
Yeah, can I just ask Sarah a question in terms of forecasting? Because we heard earlier that during December 23rd to January 2014, there was this sort of unprecedented situation of the wettest 2 months. Given that we have the ability to do long-range forecasting, and given the current situation with the known floodplains and the developments, are you able to forecast a possibility of another major crisis like that in London? And if you are, when and where would that?
There we go. Well,
Yes, I would. Steve just said I'd be a very rich person. So in terms of forecasting, the Environment Agency has a partnership with the Met Office, and we have the Flood Forecasting Centre. So they work specifically, it's been around for about 10 years now, and they work closely together in a centre together down in Exeter, where they look at the weather forecast and then the likely impact on flood risk, and they produce a flood guidance statement. So that's done weekly. In terms of that long-range forecasting, yes, we do have assessments of how the groundwater is performing. We also we understand our river levels. We have a network of gauges that allow us to monitor river levels across the country. I think the more challenging forecasting, the way you don't have the big lead-in time, is around surface water. You can't always predict where the really heavy, intense rain is going to fall. So that is still proving a challenge. You can have some idea of looking at thunderstorms, and what we would do now is we would gear up, we would escalate and put the procedures in place where our incident rosters are populated and our incident rooms are open, ready should that occur, and we're looking at the warning and the informing that comes after the forecasting. In terms of the tidal flood risk, we have a much longer lead-in time. We can look at the tidal predictions. We can look at whether there's a surge coming. We can look at whether wind is also coming with that, and we can prepare in advance for those sorts of circumstances. The fluvial rivers in London react very quickly to heavy rainfall, so they can come up a metre in a matter of an hour or two, you know. So they respond quickly because they're what's known as conveyance systems. So that the idea when they were built and very concrete in the 60s was to get the water to the Thames as quickly as you could. What we're trying to do now is kind of manage that and create spaces for water to slow down that flow, so you don't see these huge increases and spilling out everywhere. So we can forecast for those rivers. We do, and we put flood warnings out on the basis of those forecasts and those flood guidance statements that come from the Flood Forecasting Centre. And we 24/7 have people that are on duty looking at those risks, but we scale up if we think there are predicted impacts.
Yes, did you have anything to say, Alex?
Yes, we have something called ICM Live, or Storm Chasing, as it's known to its friends and admirers, which is basically where we look at the incoming weather reports, we look at the intensity of the storms, we look at the level of depth of drainage in our sewers, and then we try and identify where there might be hot spots, and we then go and either proactively clear those hot spots, or where we know we might have work undergoing in the sewer, which may mean we lose some of our capacity, we quickly remove that work. So if we're working on penstocks, for example, in the sewer, which would mean that we've had to shut the sewer off and we see heavy rain coming in, we'll quickly take down those works to make sure that the sewer is able to pass through that water. So it's something we've started, we've seen good success for it, and we're currently working with the sector to try and identify how can we create a low-cost sensor that we can put in our sewers so we know how full they are all the way across the network, so we can move to a smart system where we can understand in much more granularity how full is the sewer, where is the rain falling, how is the sewer responding, right, do we need to do some preemptive work before that water moves further through the system.
Okay, good to hear. And Steve, in terms of just to focus on residents now, and just maybe a couple of questions about the most vulnerable. Your planning, and we've heard about your mutual aid, but what key learnings did you take out of your experience about the assistance to the most vulnerable residents in circumstances like those that you experienced around 2013-14?
So I think what did come to light very quickly is that we, as an authority, don't hold a single source of data. and not just about vulnerable residents, but around sort of critical infrastructure, so substations and those types of equipment. The treatment works, although we knew about the treatment works that was there. But the vulnerable people, we struggled to get the information together, and what we have done since then is that we do now have an updated vulnerable list in those flood areas. So we do keep that, I say regularly, it's quarterly, if not 6 monthly, just to double check that those vulnerable people are still there. And there are provisions in place built within the plans that we have, should we need to activate that plans, that we know that they are there, and we put provisions in place to either support them and or, if necessary, relocate them, whether that's temporary or for a longer period of time. We did have to evacuate a number of properties during that period, and that was part of the learning curve of understanding that we didn't actually know for sure who those vulnerable people were. We did for our own stock, so our own housing stock, but we didn't for the private sector. So it's that split that we struggled to get the information.
Okay. And Cassie, just coming now to, given all that we know, that, flooding is taking place in some place, or is due to or will do, we were informed that 25% of Londoners don't have flood insurance. Can you think that the GLA has a role in raising awareness about the reality of the circumstance and, using the GLA's huge communication and advertising resources to make that a little bit more prominent?
Yeah, well, just last year, actually, we ran London's first London Flood Awareness Week. I think it was November. I can get the date, I'm pretty sure it was November. And that was all about engaging Londoners and getting and raising awareness of the impacts of flooding and also the flood risk that people were living within and so on. So it was in partnership with the London Resilience Forum and the Environment Agency. And our aim was to try and, firstly we distributed some leaflets about information, but also flood packs, so that people, if they were living in areas of high flood risk, could, for example, one of the things people can do to prepare is to put their stuff in waterproof bags, their valuables and small things, so that they have those available. And we promoted it across social media platforms, so the GLA's, the Mayor of London's Facebook and Twitter. We had some good, we had a letter, sent out to 100,000 London households who were on priority service registered and in areas of flood risk, so it was really trying to target those who were most vulnerable. We had a web app and a quiz that reached over 22,000 Londoners, and people signing up for further information. We pointed them to the Environment Agency's flood forecasting service, because you can sign up, I think, for text message and email updates on there, so it's about driving traffic. And we're going to hold, we're planning on holding a similar event this year, again tying in with, so the Environment Agency have a National Flood Awareness Week, and so then we think it's a good idea to have a London aspect as part of that week, so really trying to engage with London as well and using some of those messages. So yes, I agree.
Yeah, because there's another old myth, isn't there, that flooding is an act of God, but of course it's not.
If the water main goes.
Not if developers have built over the natural resources and caused human problems. So there is a need for greater awareness.
And we can try and manage the risk, but I think we're recognising we can't eliminate it. And so how can we raise awareness of how to sometimes minimise the impact those events might have on Londoners as well by raising that awareness. So yes, we think it's very important as well.
It's also as well, I think, an opportunity for more sort of cross-funnel working within the GLA. In terms of the messages that are sent out and working with insurance companies? I don't know. It just
Yes.
seems...
So we are actually, through the London Climate Change Partnership, we have some links to the insurance sector there, and flood risk insurance is an area we've been talking about with them. There is a programme, isn't there, the Flood Re-Insurance Programme, which you might be able to tell more details about than me, but I know there is some talk, that's a national programme, but there is some talk of that coming to an end, and so what would come next, and so we're trying to look at what's the state of play in London around insurance, so in parallel to giving information to Londoners and raising awareness and giving them key information, but also then bringing in the insurance sector and actually understanding what, do they have data gaps, so they're, what are some of the issues they're facing, and how can we promote that need across London.
Because it's not undermining what's been done at Borough. This is just a strategic piece, bringing in these insurance companies and stuff. Well, it's good to hear that something's going on, and maybe we just need to make it more current, keep it higher up the agenda at all times.
And with London Flood Awareness Week, I think it's also about it building a bit as well. So it was successful last year. We were really pleased. We've learned a lot from that as well. The materials that worked and got good engagement, and we'll build on that this year as well. And we had great links out to community groups as well to try and get a reach. So it wasn't all about the biggest number we could reach. It was also about who we were reaching through that. So, for example, those members of the community who may have less ability to adapt or capacity to adapt, whether that's people with disabilities or low incomes, maybe they were going to be, less likely to have insurance. So we're trying to target those messages as well. And I think that was some great learnings from the first year. And then now we can take that and say, okay, this is how we target the messages, and this is how we get a broader reach. So that was the approach we've taken.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Sean, you wanted to come in.
To Thames Water, why isn't it on the bill? If my bill said, have you got flood insurance, I would definitely consider it.
Well, I'm not sure flood risk is really something we want to communicate. We're very limited in the amount of... We've done a lot of studies to say, how do you impact people through what you put on the bill? Unfortunately, there is a phenomenal amount of people who don't even read their bill. And therefore we need to make sure that every bit that is on the bill is as impactful as possible. So we would be promoting measures first about water efficiency and leakage within their homes, and then it would be about our sort of bin it, don't block it messages about people not flushing things down the loos that then blocks the sewers that then causes flooding elsewhere. So as flood insurance is not really part of our remit.
I accept what you're saying about the bill. When you're in politics, the notion of a leaflet is not lost on you. The point I'm making, you have flood maps. You are the organisation that speaks most directly to the people involved in this. You could, on the back of the bill, periodically, I get that you have to have other things on that bill, but you wouldn't have to do it all the time, would you? Just put on the back of the bill, you're in a high flood risk area, do you have flood insurance? That would be impactful. Even 5, 10, 15% of the people who received that bill read the bill, we would be ahead of where we are now. And I'd argue in this arena, your business, Thames Water, carries weight. If I picked up my bill and it said you're in a flood risk area, because it came from you, I would pay attention.
I would wonder whether they're selling insurance as well.
Well, no, you're not allowed. Well, we don't want to see you selling insurance, but the point is, it's because
the local authority could also be giving those messages.
Of course they could, but this is the water authority, and it's just about what's a teachable moment. If you talk to me about water and it's Thames Water who does that, I will listen more. If my local garage talks to me about flowers, I'm not interested.
And certainly take that away. I think we would be worried there'd be an implicit understanding that therefore somehow we're responsible for flooding, and therefore that would send the wrong message, and we'd rather get across the message of water efficiency
but
and
the
sewer
flooding
blockages.
that you're not responsible for. People are not silly. You do not control how much it rains. We understand that, and if flooding you are responsible for by burst pipes, you are responsible for. So I don't see that as a problem. What it is, it's about a point of information helping your customers. You could make a significant difference to the outcomes of people who are flooded out.
I will certainly take that away. I wish it was that easy and we had that effect, that our bills had that effect on it. I think something like less than 1% of people actually react to any kind of
I accept your fact that people are at home pouring on your bills, but it is an important intervention that you could make very low cost, very high
I think
impact.
Steve just wanted to
Go for it, Steve.
All I was going to say from a local authority perspective, I'm more than happy for Thames Water to take that away. But in reality, I think it's probably one for the local authority. And what I can say, and from Croydon's perspective, we communicate with our residents on a regular basis via sort of your Croydon magazines and or for any communication. The council tax bill, albeit not on the bill, but the literature that goes with the bill, we could periodically consider that and signpost people about insurance so they can at least check.
Absolutely. I don't say that Thames should do it on their own.
No.
Both of you would be really important, because when you get flooded out and all of your stuff is gone, if you can't replace that stuff, that's a material effect on your life. If someone had let you know you were in a flood area and you could pursue some kind of insurance, it would make a real difference to people. And any way we could get that message across should be pursued.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our meeting. Thank you all very much.
One moment. There's
sorry?
one thing that we could perhaps have as a recommendation, and I'd like to ask. I think nearly all of you have mentioned riparian owners. Now, when we were doing the Blue Ribbon strategy here, we found that even on the Thames, there wasn't a register of riparian owners. Now, can I ask, I guess it's the Environment Agency, do you know who the riparian owners are?
For the tidal frontages, yes.
Yes.
We do have that understanding, and we work with those owners when we need to do maintenance work on the tidal walls. There is a responsibility for those riparian owners to part fund some of that maintenance.
Yes, I understand that point.
Yes.
I think we had it from Steve, who said that you took it on yourselves to do work because, as I understood it, difficulty in dealing with the owners. Is that right?
That's correct. I will say that in Croydon we know who the riparian owners. The reason we know is because it's the property at which the asset runs through. So we do know. The issue for us will be keeping that information updated, and actually should we keep it updated because we have other information around council tax bills, etc. So we know the property for which are responsible for it. The decision we took not to charge was purely around the fact that we were dealing with a major incident and we had to deal with it. That doesn't mean that we will continue doing that, and we do and have informed all riparian owners of their duty.
The reason I ask this, I go back to Blue Ribbon Strategy, where we, more than a dozen years ago, I think, where we didn't have that. What about your little rivers like Beverley Brook, the Hogs Mill? We've all had mention of the Wandle. What about the owners there?
Yeah, I think we work with our partner organisations to understand the kind of the ownership of that. We do have estates teams. We do have sort of people that can search land registry for us. What we try to do is a broader campaign around people understanding their risk and their riparian responsibilities. So the agency does produce a document called Living on the Edge, which we used to circulate hard copies of. It's now unfortunately only an online copy, but tries to inform people of their duties and responsibilities and that of the organisations, because it can be very confusing in a flood incident where the water's come from and who it is that then should look after that. So there are resources out there to do that. There's limited people to kind of promote that and engage.
Well, to cut it
obviously.
short, the reason I raised it was because I was going to suggest that maybe a recommendation that we could make was that there be a register of the riparian owners, but since it appears that you actually do know them, there's no point.
Indeed. Well, thank you for clearing that up, Tony. That's very helpful. So that does bring us to the end of today's discussion. So I'd like to very much thank all of our guests for your contributions, and particularly as we've had the event in Finsbury Park, which has brought it front and centre, the harm of flooding and the impact on Londoners' everyday lives. So all the work that you are all doing together is hugely important for the well-being of Londoners. So thank you to our guests. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the subsequent discussion, and delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group leads to agree any output arising from the discussion.
Yep.
Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the progress on its work programme and the topics agreed by the GLA Oversight Committee on the 1st of July 2019 for the meetings from July to October 2019?
Agreed.
And the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 7th of November 2019 at 10 a.m. in the chamber at City Hall. There are no other items of urgent business. The meeting is over. Thank you very much.
In relation to what
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA Chamber Sound.